7-year-old Emma Mitchell stared at her reflection in the courthouse bathroom mirror, her tiny hands trembling uncontrollably beneath the cold water of the faucet. Her pale hair was neatly braided by her mother that morning, tied with a pink ribbon that now felt suffocating around her head. She looked so small in the oversized bathroom, dwarfed by the marble counters and institutional lighting that made everything appear harsh and clinical. Her blue eyes, usually bright and full of childhood wonder, now appeared haunted, shadowed by an emotional burden no 7-year-old should ever carry. Her father's words echoed relentlessly in her mind, playing on repeat like a broken record she couldn't stop. "If you tell them you want to live with me, everything will be perfect. We'll go to Disneyland every weekend. We'll get that puppy you've always wanted, but if you don't, if you say you want to stay with mommy, I'll be heartbroken forever. You'll break daddy's heart into a million pieces and it will be your fault. Do you want to do that to me, Emma? Do you want your daddy to be sad forever?" The words were a weapon more powerful than any physical force. Emma's chest tightened, making it difficult to breathe. She gripped the edge of the sink, her small knuckles turning white from the pressure. Her heart raced with an anxiety that felt too enormous for her small body to contain. She was 7 years old, in 2nd grade, still learning multiplication tables, still afraid of the dark, still sleeping with a stuffed bunny named Mr. Floppy. She shouldn't have to carry this weight. She shouldn't have to make decisions that would determine whose heart broke and whose didn't. Last week, her father had picked her up from school in his shiny black Mercedes, the one her mother said was too fancy and impractical. He'd driven her to his apartment in the city, the tall building with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire skyline. Instead of letting her play or watch cartoons like usual, he'd sat her down at his sleek glass dining table and began the rehearsals. "Okay, princess, we need to practice what you're going to tell the judge," he'd said, his voice sweet but with an undertone of seriousness that frightened her. He'd pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten lines, words he wanted her to memorize and repeat exactly as written. "Say this: I love my daddy more than anything in the world. Daddy is the best. Daddy takes me to fun places. Mommy is mean to me. Mommy makes me sad. I want to live with daddy forever," he recited slowly, pointing to each line in the notebook. Emma had read the words hesitantly, stumbling over some of them. Her father's expression darkened immediately. "No, no, no, that's not right. Again. More feeling this time. You have to sound like you really mean it." They'd practiced for 3 hours. 3 hours of repetition, correction, and his increasingly frustrated sighs whenever she made a mistake or failed to sound convincing enough. He'd even made her stand up and practice in front of the mirror, coaching her facial expressions and the tone of her voice. "Smile when you say you love daddy," he instructed. "Look sad when you talk about mommy. The judge needs to believe you." By the end of the 3 hours, Emma's voice was hoarse, her head ached, and tears of exhaustion streamed down her face. Her father had finally seemed satisfied, kissing her forehead gently and saying, "You're doing this for us, princess. You're being such a good girl. This is how we show the judge that you belong with daddy. Do you understand?" Emma had nodded numbly, but she didn't understand. She didn't understand why she had to lie about her mother, whom she loved dearly. She didn't understand why her father needed her to say mean things. She didn't understand why the adults in her life couldn't just figure this out without making her choose between them. But what Emma understood perfectly was fear. The fear of disappointing her father, the fear of making him sad, the fear of being labeled a bad daughter. That fear was suffocating her, drowning her from the inside out. Now, standing in the courthouse bathroom, Emma looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the frightened little girl staring back. She was supposed to go into that courtroom in just a few minutes. She was supposed to stand in front of a judge and a room full of strangers and say all those rehearsed lies. She was supposed to perform like an actress in a play, pretending that her mother was mean and that she desperately wanted to live with her father instead. But something inside her screamed against it. A quiet voice deep in her chest whispered that what she was being asked to do was wrong. That voice told her that lying under oath, whatever that meant exactly, was serious. That voice reminded her that her mother had never been mean to her, had never made her sad on purpose, had always been there to comfort her and love her unconditionally. She heard her mother's voice from outside the bathroom. "Emma, sweetheart, are you ready? We need to go inside soon." Sarah Mitchell stood in the courthouse hallway, wringing her hands nervously. She was dressed in a professional navy blazer and skirt, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked strong and composed on the outside, but internally, she was terrified. She'd been fighting for 2 years to maintain her relationship with her daughter after the separation, watching helplessly as Richard seemed to be poisoning Emma's mind against her. The messages from Emma had become increasingly confusing, sometimes full of love, sometimes containing statements that didn't sound like her daughter at all. Sarah knew something was deeply wrong, but she couldn't prove it. Not yet. She had hired a custody attorney who'd assured her that the truth would come out in court. But as she waited for Emma to emerge from the bathroom, Sarah felt her confidence wavering. Richard was charming and manipulative. His attorney was aggressive and expensive. What if the judge believed him? What if Emma had already been coached so thoroughly that she would perform her father's script without flinching? Max, their golden retriever, sat calmly beside Sarah, his warm brown eyes tracking every movement in the hallway. Max was a trained emotional support animal, certified to help Emma through the stressful court proceedings. But even Max seemed to sense the tension crackling through the courthouse. His tail, usually perpetually wagging, remained still. His ears were perked forward, alert and sensitive to the anxiety radiating from everyone around him. When Emma finally emerged from the bathroom, Sarah could immediately see that something was wrong. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Emma moved like a robot, each step mechanical and disconnected. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, gently taking her small face in her hands. "Emma, honey, are you okay? You look upset," Sarah asked, concern flooding her voice. Emma's lip quivered, and for a moment it seemed like she might tell her mother everything, about the rehearsals, the lies, the script, the pressure. But then she glanced down the hallway and saw her father standing near the courtroom entrance, watching them intently. His expression was neutral, but his eyes conveyed a clear warning. "Don't tell." Emma looked back at her mother and forced a small smile. "I'm okay, Mommy, just nervous." Sarah wanted to push further, to demand to know what was really going on. But the bailiff was calling for them to enter the courtroom. Time had run out. Sarah squeezed Emma's hand gently and stood up, leading her daughter toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Max walked beside them, his presence a comforting anchor. Emma looked down at her loyal companion and felt a small measure of peace. Max loved her unconditionally. Max didn't ask her to lie or perform. Max simply accepted her completely. In that moment, Emma realized that Max was the only being in her life who truly understood how lost and frightened she felt. As they approached the courtroom doors, Emma whispered softly to Max, "Max, what should I do?" The dog pressed his warm body against her leg in response, as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone. Whatever happens, I will be right here beside you." As they stepped through the courtroom doors, Emma's hands trembled, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode out of her chest. She looked around the intimidating room filled with official-looking people, expensive furniture, and stern faces. Her father sat at one table with his attorney. Her mother sat at another table with her attorney. And in the center of it all sat Judge Harrison, an imposing figure whose decision would determine the rest of Emma's childhood. The judge looked down at the little girl entering the courtroom and seemed to sense immediately that something significant was about to unfold in his courtroom. He had no idea, however, just how dramatically the next few hours would change everyone's lives. Emma's stomach churned with anxiety. She clutched Mr. Floppy, the stuffed bunny her mother had allowed her to bring, so tightly that she thought she might tear a hole in it. The lies sat heavy on her tongue, ready to be spoken. The pressure from her father weighed on her shoulders like a physical force. And somewhere deep inside her 7-year-old heart, Emma wondered, Could she really go through with this? Or would her conscience find another way to break free? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. 7-year-old Emma Mitchell stared at her reflection in the courthouse bathroom mirror, her tiny hands trembling uncontrollably beneath the cold water of the faucet. Her pale hair was neatly braided by her mother that morning, tied with a pink ribbon that now felt suffocating around her head. She looked so small in the oversized bathroom, dwarfed by the marble counters and institutional lighting that made everything appear harsh and clinical. Her blue eyes, usually bright and full of childhood wonder, now appeared haunted, shadowed by an emotional burden no 7-year-old should ever carry. Her father's words echoed relentlessly in her mind, playing on repeat like a broken record she couldn't stop. If you tell them you want to live with me, everything will be perfect. We'll go to Disneyland every weekend. We'll get that puppy you've always wanted. But if you don't, if you say you want to stay with mommy, I'll be heartbroken forever. You'll break daddy's heart into a million pieces and it will be your fault. Do you want to do that to me, Emma? Do you want your daddy to be sad forever? The words were a weapon more powerful than any physical force. Emma's chest tightened, making it difficult to breathe. She gripped the edge of the sink, her small knuckles turning white from the pressure. Her heart raced with an anxiety that felt too enormous for her small body to contain. She was 7 years old, in 2nd grade, still learning multiplication tables, still afraid of the dark, still sleeping with a stuffed bunny named Mr. Floppy. She shouldn't have to carry this weight. She shouldn't have to make decisions that would determine whose heart broke and whose didn't. Last week, her father had picked her up from school in his shiny black Mercedes, the one her mother said was too fancy and impractical. He'd driven her to his apartment in the city, the tall building with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire skyline. Instead of letting her play or watch cartoons like usual, he'd sat her down at his sleek glass dining table and began the rehearsals. "Okay, princess, we need to practice what you're going to tell the judge," he'd said, his voice sweet but with an undertone of seriousness that frightened her. He'd pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten lines, words he wanted her to memorize and repeat exactly as written. "Say this: I love my daddy more than anything in the world. Daddy is the best. Daddy takes me to fun places. Mommy is mean to me. Mommy makes me sad. I want to live with Daddy forever," he recited slowly, pointing to each line in the notebook. Emma had read the words hesitantly, stumbling over some of them. Her father's expression darkened immediately. "No, no, no, that's not right. Again, more feeling this time. You have to sound like you really mean it." They'd practiced for 3 hours. 3 hours of repetition, correction, and his increasingly frustrated sighs whenever she made a mistake or failed to sound convincing enough. He'd even made her stand up and practice in front of the mirror, coaching her facial expressions and the tone of her voice. "Smile when you say you love Daddy," he instructed. "Look sad when you talk about Mommy. The judge needs to believe you." By the end of the 3 hours, Emma's voice was hoarse, her head ached, and tears of exhaustion streamed down her face. Her father had finally seemed satisfied, kissing her forehead gently and saying, "You're doing this for us, princess. You're being such a good girl. This is how we show the judge that you belong with Daddy. Do you understand?" Emma had nodded numbly, but she didn't understand. She didn't understand why she had to lie about her mother, whom she loved dearly. She didn't understand why her father needed her to say mean things. She didn't understand why the adults in her life couldn't just figure this out without making her choose between them. But what Emma understood perfectly was fear. The fear of disappointing her father, the fear of making him sad, the fear of being labeled a bad daughter. That fear was suffocating her, drowning her from the inside out. Now, standing in the courthouse bathroom, Emma looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the frightened little girl staring back. She was supposed to go into that courtroom in just a few minutes. She was supposed to stand in front of a judge and a room full of strangers and say all those rehearsed lies. She was supposed to perform like an actress in a play, pretending that her mother was mean and that she desperately wanted to live with her father instead. But something inside her screamed against it. A quiet voice deep in her chest whispered that what she was being asked to do was wrong. That voice told her that lying under oath, whatever that meant exactly, was serious. That voice reminded her that her mother had never been mean to her, had never made her sad on purpose, had always been there to comfort her and love her unconditionally. She heard her mother's voice from outside the bathroom. "Emma, sweetheart, are you ready? We need to go inside soon." Sarah Mitchell stood in the courthouse hallway, wringing her hands nervously. She was dressed in a professional navy blazer and skirt, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked strong and composed on the outside, but internally, she was terrified. She'd been fighting for 2 years to maintain her relationship with her daughter after the separation, watching helplessly as Richard seemed to be poisoning Emma's mind against her. The messages from Emma had become increasingly confusing, sometimes full of love, sometimes containing statements that didn't sound like her daughter at all. Sarah knew something was deeply wrong, but she couldn't prove it. Not yet. She had hired a custody attorney who'd assured her that the truth would come out in court. But as she waited for Emma to emerge from the bathroom, Sarah felt her confidence wavering. Richard was charming and manipulative. His attorney was aggressive and expensive. What if the judge believed him? What if Emma had already been coached so thoroughly that she would perform her father's script without flinching? Max, their golden retriever, sat calmly beside Sarah, his warm brown eyes tracking every movement in the hallway. Max was a trained emotional support animal, certified to help Emma through the stressful court proceedings. But even Max seemed to sense the tension crackling through the courthouse. His tail, usually perpetually wagging, remained still. His ears were perked forward, alert and sensitive to the anxiety radiating from everyone around him. When Emma finally emerged from the bathroom, Sarah could immediately see that something was wrong. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Emma moved like a robot, each step mechanical and disconnected. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, gently taking her small face in her hands. "Emma, honey, are you okay? You look upset," Sarah asked, concern flooding her voice. Emma's lip quivered, and for a moment it seemed like she might tell her mother everything, about the rehearsals, the lies, the script, the pressure. But then she glanced down the hallway and saw her father standing near the courtroom entrance, watching them intently. His expression was neutral, but his eyes conveyed a clear warning. "Don't tell." Emma looked back at her mother and forced a small smile. "I'm okay, Mommy, just nervous." Sarah wanted to push further, to demand to know what was really going on. But the bailiff was calling for them to enter the courtroom. Time had run out. Sarah squeezed Emma's hand gently and stood up, leading her daughter toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Max walked beside them, his presence a comforting anchor. Emma looked down at her loyal companion and felt a small measure of peace. Max loved her unconditionally. Max didn't ask her to lie or perform. Max simply accepted her completely. In that moment, Emma realized that Max was the only being in her life who truly understood how lost and frightened she felt. As they approached the courtroom doors, Emma whispered softly to Max, "Max, what should I do?" The dog pressed his warm body against her leg in response, as if to say, "I'm here. You're not alone. Whatever happens, I will be right here beside you." As they stepped through the courtroom doors, Emma's hands trembled, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode out of her chest. She looked around the intimidating room filled with official-looking people, expensive furniture, and stern faces. Her father sat at one table with his attorney. Her mother sat at another table with her attorney. And in the center of it all sat Judge Harrison, an imposing figure whose decision would determine the rest of Emma's childhood. The judge looked down at the little girl entering the courtroom and seemed to sense immediately that something significant was about to unfold in his courtroom. He had no idea, however, just how dramatically the next few hours would change everyone's lives. Emma's stomach churned with anxiety. She clutched Mr. Floppy, the stuffed bunny her mother had allowed her to bring, so tightly that she thought she might tear a hole in it. The lies sat heavy on her tongue, ready to be spoken. The pressure from her father weighed on her shoulders like a physical force. And somewhere deep inside her 7-year-old heart, Emma wondered, could she really go through with this? Or would her conscience find another way to break free? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. The courtroom doors closed behind them with a heavy, final-sounding thud that reverberated through Emma's entire body like a funeral bell. Judge Harrison sat elevated on his mahogany bench, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his expression stern and unreadable. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair, deep-set eyes that had witnessed countless family tragedies, and the bearing of someone who had spent 4 decades seeing humanity at its absolute worst. His black robe seemed to amplify his authority, making him appear larger than life to Emma's 7-year-old perspective. The courtroom itself was intimidating, all dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and official seals on the walls. A large American flag stood in one corner, and portraits of past judges stared down from the walls like ghostly witnesses to every family's pain that had unfolded within these walls. The gallery was sparsely populated. A few journalists who'd gotten wind of an interesting custody case, Sarah's best friend, Richard's mother, and a court reporter ready to transcribe every word spoken. Richard sat at his table with his attorney, Wellington, a man in his early 50s with slick-back dark hair, an expensive suit, and the confident bearing of someone who'd won more custody cases than he'd lost. Wellington was known in legal circles as a shark, someone who would destroy the other parent's credibility without hesitation or remorse if it meant getting his client what he wanted. He had a reputation for winning, regardless of the circumstances or what was actually in the child's best interest. Sarah sat at the opposite table with her attorney, Jennifer, a younger woman in her 40s with hair and kind eyes. Jennifer was a passion-driven attorney who'd gone into family law specifically because she cared about children's welfare. She was less experienced than Wellington but far more ethical. She'd taken Sarah's case pro because she believed that Emma's mother deserved to be heard and that the truth needed to be protected in this courtroom. The judge banged his gavel once, the sound like a thunderclap in the tense silence. This court is now in session. Case number 2023 FC 4782, Mitchell versus Mitchell custody hearing. Let the record show that all parties are present, as well as the minor child Emma Mitchell. Emma sat in a special chair elevated slightly so she could see over the witness stand if called to testify. She was technically not supposed to hear everything that would be said today, but in reality, she would hear much of it. The court had tried to shield her by having her sit with a court-appointed guardian ad, a woman named Ms. who was supposed to represent Emma's best interests. But Emma was acutely aware of everything happening around her. Judge Harrison looked at the attorneys. "I've reviewed the case files and initial motions. This court is prepared to hear opening arguments. Mr. Wellington, you may begin." Richard's attorney stood with theatrical flair, buttoning his suit jacket and turning to face the judge with a rehearsed expression of moral outrage. His voice was smooth, practiced, and designed to convince through emotional manipulation rather than fact-based argument. "Your Honor, my client, Richard Mitchell, is a loving, devoted father who has been systematically alienated from his daughter by a vindictive, manipulative mother who cannot accept that their relationship has ended," Wellington began, gesturing dramatically toward Sarah. "The evidence will show that Sarah Mitchell has emotionally poisoned this child against her father, telling her lies, coaching her to make false accusations, and deliberately attempting to destroy the bond between father and daughter." Sarah's face flushed red with indignation. Her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. She wanted to stand up and shout that every word was a lie, but Jennifer placed a calming hand on her arm, silencing her. "Richard Mitchell is a successful businessman, an involved father, and a man who has done nothing but love his daughter with every fiber of his being," Wellington continued. "This case represents a classic example of parental alienation syndrome, where a rejected mother weaponizes her child against the father. The court should award primary custody to my client immediately and impose restrictions on the mother's visitation to prevent further damage. Emma felt her stomach turn. Everything he said was backwards. Her father had never been particularly involved. He'd missed countless school plays, soccer games, and birthday parties because of important work meetings. It was her mother who attended every event, who helped with homework, who held her when she was sick or scared. Then Jennifer stood up. Her voice was quieter than Wellington's, but it carried a weight of sincerity and genuine concern that cut through his theatrical performance like a knife. Your Honor, the evidence in this case will reveal a troubling pattern of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse of a minor child by her father, Jennifer said, her voice steady and controlled. Mr. Richard Mitchell has been systematically coaching his daughter to make false statements, rehearsing lies with her, and using emotional blackmail and threats to coerce her compliance. This is not parental alienation. This is child abuse. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A journalist in the gallery scribbled furiously on her notepad. Richard's expression remained composed, but his jaw clenched slightly, a tell that Jennifer had struck a nerve. We have evidence, text messages, recordings, and testimony from educators and child development specialists that will demonstrate that Emma Mitchell is a victim of parental manipulation, Jennifer continued. The child loves both parents equally and naturally, but one parent has weaponized that love against the other. The court's role today is to protect this child from further psychological harm and to ensure that custody is awarded to the parent who prioritizes Emma's over personal revenge. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He presided over many custody cases, and he knew that the truth usually lay somewhere in the middle of both parties' claims. But he also knew that some cases were not ambiguous at all. Some cases involved clear evidence of one parent's wrongdoing. He would need to hear the evidence before making determinations, but he was already wondering if there might be more substance to Jennifer's accusations than typical custody case drama. Very well, Judge Harrison said. Mr. Wellington, you may call your first witness. The defense calls Richard Mitchell to the stand, Wellington announced. Emma watched as her father stood up, straightened his tie, and walked to the witness stand. He raised his hand and took the oath, swearing to tell the truth. Emma knew this was a lie before he'd even said anything. She'd watched him rehearse his testimony with the same precision he'd used to rehearse her lies. Richard took his seat in the witness stand, and Wellington began his questioning. Mr. Mitchell, can you describe for the court your relationship with your daughter Emma? I love Emma more than anything in the world, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion that seemed entirely theatrical to Emma. Since the separation, Sarah has done everything in her power to turn Emma against me. She coaches her with stories about how I don't care about her, how I'm a bad father. Emma has told me that her mother has instructed her to lie about me in court. It was pure inversion of the truth. Emma felt her chest tighten with anxiety and confusion. She wanted to scream that he was lying, but she was frozen in her seat, unable to move or speak. Jennifer waited patiently for Wellington to finish his questioning before she began her cross-examination. When it was her turn, she stood up with several documents in her hand. Mr. Mitchell, I'm showing you what's marked as Exhibit A. A text message you sent to your daughter on March 15th of this year at 8:47 p.m. Can you read it aloud for the court? Richard's face paled as he looked at the document. The text read, "Tell the judge that mommy makes you sad and that you want to live with daddy only. If you do this perfectly, I'll take you to Disneyland and buy you anything you want." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispered commentary. Even Judge Harrison's eyes widened slightly, a rare display of emotion from the seasoned jurist. Richard's attorney began to object, but before he could even form the words, Jennifer hit him with another piece of evidence. Your Honor, I also have an audio recording. I'm playing it now for the record, Jennifer announced. A speaker crackled to life and Richard's voice filled the courtroom. Emma, listen to me very carefully. You're going to tell the judge that mommy is mean. You're going to say that mommy yells at you and makes you feel sad. You're going to practice this until you sound like you really mean it. Do you understand?" Emma's small voice could be heard. "Yes, Daddy." Then Richard's voice again. "If you don't do this correctly, everyone is going to know that you're being a bad daughter. And if you're a bad daughter, Daddy will be very sad and disappointed." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the journalists had stopped writing, stunned by what they were hearing. Sarah was crying quietly, her hand over her mouth. Max, sitting beside Emma, had tensed, as if sensing the enormity of what was being revealed. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture of profound concern and disappointment. He looked at Richard with an expression that could only be described as disgust. "Mr. Mitchell, I believe we have sufficient evidence to conclude that your testimony was perjurious," Judge Harrison said coldly. "Court officers, I'm instructing you to place Mr. Richard Mitchell under investigation for perjury and child abuse. This hearing is adjourned for 48 hours. The gavel came down hard, and the courtroom erupted into chaos. Richard's face turned white as court officers approached him. His attorney was whispering urgently in his ear, realizing that the case had just taken a dramatic and devastating turn for his client. Emma felt something shift inside her. The recordings had been presented. Her father's manipulation had been exposed. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew that something fundamental had changed in the universe that morning. And through it all, Max remained steadfastly by her side, a silent witness to justice beginning to unfold. The 48-hour recess felt like an eternity to Emma. She'd spent those 2 days in a strange state of suspended animation, caught between relief and terror. The recordings had exposed her father's manipulation, but she still loved him. She still hoped, irrationally, that somehow everything would work out, that her father would apologize and they could go back to how things were before the separation, when he seemed to actually care about her rather than just using her as a weapon in his war against her mother. Sarah had tried to comfort Emma during those 2 days, but Emma found herself withdrawing emotionally. She couldn't explain to her mother what she was feeling because she didn't fully understand it herself. How could she love someone who had hurt her? How could she want to protect her father even after hearing the recordings that proved he'd been manipulating her all along? These were adult emotions wrapped in a child's confused mind, and Emma carried them heavily on her small shoulders. The night before the resumed hearing, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with anxiety. Her mother had tried to reassure her. "Emma, you don't have to lie anymore. The judge knows what your father has been doing. You're safe now." But Emma didn't feel safe. She felt guilty. She felt complicit. She felt like she was betraying her father by staying quiet about his coaching and lies. The manipulation he'd inflicted on her had been so complete that she'd internalized his narrative, that everything was somehow her responsibility, her fault, her burden to fix. Max had sensed her distress and spent the entire night pressed against her side, his warm, solid presence the only thing keeping Emma from completely falling apart. The dog somehow understood that his girl was suffering, and he refused to leave her side, not even when Sarah called him to get a drink of water or go outside. When morning came, Emma dressed in the same outfit she'd worn 2 days before, a pale blue dress that suddenly felt too small and too restrictive. Sarah braided her hair again, tying it back with the same pink ribbon, though Emma thought the ribbon seemed to mock her now rather than comfort her. They arrived at the courthouse an hour early, and the hallways seemed even more intimidating on this day than they had before. Judge Harrison was already in his chambers, reviewing additional evidence and statements that had been submitted during the recess. The investigation into Richard had revealed more than anyone had initially suspected. Teachers at Emma's school had been interviewed and had reported that Emma had made concerning statements about her father's coaching and rehearsals. A neighbor had come forward claiming she'd heard Richard yelling at Emma about getting the story right during a recent visitation. The picture emerging was not of a caring father, but of a man who viewed his daughter as a means to an end, a tool to be manipulated and controlled. At 9:30 a.m., the bailiff called for all parties to return to the courtroom. The gallery was fuller today. More journalists had arrived after the dramatic revelations of the previous hearing. Social workers from the Department of Child Services sat in the back, observing carefully. Emma's case was becoming something of a watershed moment in the county's custody law, a clear demonstration of how a child's nonverbal communication and behavioral responses could reveal truth that words alone could not capture. Judge Harrison took his seat and looked over the courtroom. Richard was present, but without the confident bearing he displayed 2 days earlier. His attorney, Wellington, had abandoned him. The recordings and evidence had made it clear that Richard was guilty of the charges, and Wellington had no interest in continuing to defend someone engaged in such obvious wrongdoing. Richard had hired a public defender instead, a weary-looking man named David who clearly wished he was anywhere but this courtroom. "This court is back in session," Judge Harrison announced. "We have significant new evidence regarding the conduct of Richard Mitchell that has come to light during the recess. Before we proceed, I want to speak with the minor child, Emma Mitchell. The court would like to offer Emma the opportunity to testify voluntarily and answer questions about her experiences. Ms., does your client wish for her daughter to testify?" Sarah looked at Emma, searching her face for any sign of whether she was ready. Emma nodded slightly, though every part of her wanted to disappear into the ground and never emerge. She understood on some level that her testimony mattered, that what she said could influence the outcome of the case, but the weight of that responsibility was crushing. "The child will testify," Jennifer confirmed. The bailiff called Emma forward. She stood up on shaking legs, her hand leaving Sarah's protective grip. Max moved to stand, but Sarah gently held the dog back. The support animal would wait. Emma had to do this part alone. Emma walked to the witness stand, her small frame seeming to shrink even further as she approached the elevated seat. The bailiff placed a special cushion on the chair so she could see over the edge, and then handed her a small Bible. "Do you swear or affirm that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked gently. Emma's voice was barely audible. "I do." She sat down in the oversized chair, her feet swinging several inches above the ground. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, understanding that what was about to unfold would be pivotal. Judge Harrison looked at Emma with an expression of deep compassion. He had been a judge for 40 years, had presided over thousands of cases, but he was still moved by the sight of a traumatized 7-year-old about to recount her abuse. "Emma, my name is Judge Harrison," he began gently. "I know this is a scary place and I know you've been through a lot, but I want you to know that you're safe here. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, tears already forming at the corners of her eyes. "Emma, can you tell me about the time when your daddy asked you to practice what you were going to tell me?" Jennifer asked softly. Emma's lip quivered. She looked toward her father, and for a moment it seemed like she might clam up, might refuse to speak. Richard's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a warning, a threat, a desperate plea all at once. But then Emma looked back toward her mother, and she saw Sarah's face, full of love, hope, and unwavering support. She saw Max, still sitting beside her mother, his dark eyes locked on Emma with perfect understanding and acceptance, and something inside her broke open. "Daddy made me practice lies," Emma said, her voice small but clear. "He read me words from a notebook. He told me to say that Mommy was mean. He told me to say I wanted to live with him, but that's not true." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "Emma, when you practiced these words, what did your daddy do if you didn't say them correctly?" Jennifer asked. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "He got angry. He told me I was being a bad daughter. He said if I didn't do it right, he would be sad forever. He said it would be my fault if he was sad." Judge Harrison's expression hardened. This was emotional abuse, plain and simple. A father using guilt and shame to manipulate his daughter into lying under oath. "Emma, do you love your daddy?" Jennifer asked. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she sobbed, but he scared me. He said if I told the truth, he would be disappointed in me. He said nobody would like me if I wasn't a good daughter." Sarah's hand went to her mouth, stifling a cry. Even Richard's public defender looked shocked and appalled by what he was hearing. "Emma, what's the truth?" Jennifer asked. "What do you really want?" Emma looked directly at Judge Harrison. "I want to live with Mommy. She never yells at me. She never makes me practice lies. She just loves me. I love Daddy too, but I'm scared of him now." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order. But before anyone could move or speak further, Emma suddenly made a gesture, a desperate signal with her right hand, 3 fingers folded, thumb extended. It was the same signal she and Max had developed, the signal that meant "help me." And that's when everything changed. Max exploded into motion. The golden retriever, perfectly calm until that moment, suddenly stood and bolted toward the witness stand. He leaped up, placing his paws on the edge of the stand, his warm brown eyes meeting Emma's with a connection so profound and authentic that it made everyone in the courtroom gasp. Judge Harrison froze mid-gavel strike. The entire courtroom became absolutely silent. What they were witnessing was something extraordinary, the physical manifestation of a child's cry for help, witnessed and answered by the only being in her life who loved her without condition, without agenda, without manipulation. The judge's eyes widened as he realized the profound truth unfolding before him. This signal, this response, was the most honest communication in the entire courtroom. This was love. This was genuine emotional connection. This was everything that had been absent between Emma and her father. Judge Harrison slowly set down his gavel, his jaw clenched with controlled fury. What he was witnessing was a turning point, a moment when the psychological abuse became undeniably, unmistakably clear to everyone present. Emma had finally, truly broken free. Time seemed to stop in the courtroom as Max's paws remained firmly planted on the edge of the witness stand, his entire body vibrating with the intensity of his connection to Emma. The golden retriever's warm brown eyes never wavered from the little girl's face, as if he were communicating something profound that transcended human language. In that frozen moment, everyone in the courtroom witnessed something that no legal argument, no evidence presentation, no testimony could have conveyed more powerfully. The absolute, unconditional love of a creature for a child in distress. Emma's small hands reached out and buried themselves in Max's thick golden fur, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. For the first time since stepping into the witness stand, she was no longer alone. She was not performing for her father's approval or trying to satisfy her mother's hopes. She was simply a frightened, traumatized 7-year-old child being comforted by the one being in her life who had never asked her to be anything other than herself. "I'm scared," Emma whispered into Max's neck, her voice muffled but audible to everyone in the silent courtroom. "I'm so scared." Max pressed his head closer to her, his entire body language communicating, "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe." Judge Harrison sat absolutely motionless in his elevated chair, his experienced eyes taking in every nuance of the interaction before him. He had presided over thousands of custody cases throughout his 4-decade career. He had heard countless children testify, many of them coached or influenced by one parent or the other. He had learned to read the subtle tells, the hesitation, the rehearsed quality to certain phrases, the fear that masked itself as obedience. But he had never witnessed anything like this. The signal Emma had made, 3 fingers folded, thumb extended, was clearly deliberate and meaningful. The fact that the dog had responded with such instantaneous and perfect understanding spoke volumes about the bond between child and animal. This was not a trained response. This was not a performance. This was genuine emotional connection in its form. The judge's mind raced through the implications. In his experience, children who had been taught to lie, children who had been coached by a manipulative parent, did not make authentic gestures. They did not break down in genuine tears. They delivered their memorized lines with the stilted quality of actors reciting a script. But Emma's testimony had been different. Her voice had trembled with authentic emotion. Her words had tumbled out in a rush of genuine confession. And most tellingly, her desperate signal to her dog represented a cry for help so primal, so honest, that no amount of coaching could have produced it. Richard sat at his table, his public defender having completely given up any pretense of defending him. Richard's face had turned ashen as he watched his daughter testify against him, watched her break down on the stand, and now watched her find comfort in the embrace of an animal rather than in the presence of her father. Tears, whether of remorse or self-pity, it was impossible to tell, streamed down his face. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The journalists in the gallery were frantically taking notes and photos, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinarily significant. One of them, a veteran court reporter named Michael Torres, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd been covering custody cases for 15 years, and he'd never seen a moment quite like this. He knew immediately that this image, a traumatized child clinging to her dog, finding safety in an animal's love, would become iconic. This would be the image that defined the case, that captured its essence in a way that no legal brief ever could. Sarah was crying openly now, her tears falling freely as she watched her daughter find comfort and safety through her connection with Max. Jennifer, Emma's attorney, was also visibly moved, though she maintained her professional composure. She understood what was happening here at a legal and psychological level. She was witnessing the breakdown of an elaborate facade, the complete exposure of a child's true emotional state after weeks of suppressed trauma. The bailiff stood uncertainly, unsure of protocol for this unprecedented situation. Typically, witnesses remained in the stand until cross-examination was completed, but what was happening now transcended courtroom procedure. This was a moment of genuine human and animal connection that transcended formality. Judge Harrison slowly rose from his chair, his gavel held loosely in his hand. He was not going to interrupt this moment. He recognized that what was unfolding before him was the truest testimony a child could give. Emma's body language, her tears, her desperate gesture, and Max's instantaneous response. These were facts more eloquent than any words spoken under oath. "Court officers," Judge Harrison said quietly, his voice carrying immense authority despite its gentleness, "I want you to understand something. This child is not to be removed from her support animal's presence. Max remains with Emma for the duration of these proceedings. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," the officers responded in unison. Judge Harrison looked at Emma, and his expression softened. "Emma, sweetheart, you can remain there with Max for as long as you need. We're going to take a brief recess while I consider how to proceed." The judge banged his gavel once, the sound somehow both authoritative and compassionate. He stood and walked toward his chambers, but not before casting a long, cold stare at Richard that communicated more than any words could. "I know the truth. I see what you've done." During the 15-minute recess, the courtroom became a flurry of whispered conversations and frantic note-taking. The journalists were already drafting headlines in their minds. "Girl's signal to dog exposes father's manipulation," or "Emotional support dog becomes star witness in custody case," or simply "Justice through love. How a child's bond with her dog changed everything." Sarah immediately rushed to Emma, embracing both her daughter and the loyal dog who had become a symbol of genuine, uncomplicated love. She whispered repeatedly to Emma, "You're so brave, baby. So incredibly brave. It's all going to be okay now. I promise you." Emma clung to her mother and her dog, the the three of them forming a unit of safety and unconditional acceptance. Emma's body still trembled with the aftermath of her emotional release, but there was something different in her now, a sense of lightness, of finally being able to set down the unbearable burden she'd been carrying. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison returned with a stack of papers and a determined expression. He looked at Richard's public defender. "Mister, I trust you've advised your client regarding the advisability of continuing with this case." David, the public defender, nodded grimly. "Your Honor, my client wishes to make a statement." "Very well," the judge replied. "Mr. Mitchell, you may address the court." Richard stood on shaking legs. His voice, when he spoke, was hollow and defeated. "Your Honor, I want to withdraw my request for custody. I'm prepared to accept whatever custody arrangements this court deems appropriate. I also want to formally apologize to my daughter for everything." He looked at Emma, but the child simply turned her face away, pressing her head against Max's warm neck. The rejection stung him, but it was no more than he deserved. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "That's wise, Mr. Mitchell. However, I need to inform you that this court is launching a formal investigation into charges of child abuse and perjury. You may be facing criminal charges in addition to the custody determination." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. This was no longer simply a custody case. This had escalated into a criminal matter. Judge Harrison turned to Emma. "Emma, this court finds that your testimony, combined with the evidence presented, demonstrates a clear pattern of emotional abuse and manipulation perpetrated by your father. Your signal to Max, and his response, demonstrated authentic distress and genuine emotional connection. This court recognizes that as one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in this entire proceeding." He banged his gavel firmly. "Preliminary custody award goes to Sarah Mitchell, pending final determination after the completion of psychological evaluation and the criminal investigation." As the gavel came down, Emma finally allowed herself to relax against Max's warm body. She didn't fully understand the legal implications of what had just happened, but she understood one thing clearly. She was safe. The truth had emerged, and the being responsible for her safety was not a judge or an attorney or even her mother, but the loyal golden retriever who had understood her desperate signal and answered it with perfect, unconditional love. Max's tail, which had been still throughout the entire proceeding, finally began to wag, a gentle, steady movement that seemed to say, "We did it. We told the truth together." Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers, the heavy wooden door closing behind him with a soft but definitive click. The room was lined with containing decades of legal volumes, case law compilations, and judicial precedents. Awards and commendations hung on the walls, recognition of his commitment to fair and thoughtful jurisprudence. But tonight, all of those accolades felt somehow irrelevant compared to what he had just witnessed in his courtroom. He poured himself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher on his mahogany desk and sank into his leather chair, his mind replaying every second of Emma's testimony, and most significantly, the moment she made that signal to Max. In his 40 years on the judicial bench, Judge Harrison had developed what colleagues called his courtroom intuition, an almost supernatural ability to read people, to separate truth from fabrication, to sense when someone was being dishonest or manipulated. It was this intuition that had made him an exceptionally effective judge, one of the most respected in the district. But what he had witnessed today transcended even his considerable experience with human psychology and courtroom dynamics. The signal Emma made, 3 fingers folded, thumb extended, had been so deliberate, so purposeful, yet so free from any performative quality that it had immediately struck him as the most honest communication in the entire proceeding. He'd heard Richard's rehearsed testimony, Emma's coached responses during practice, the attorney's carefully crafted arguments. All of it had carried the mark of human construction, of strategy, of calculated effect. But that signal was pure instinct. That signal was a child's desperate cry for help, expressed through a gesture so personal and meaningful that it had only one possible audience: Max, the one being in her life who truly understood her without judgment or agenda. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, thinking about the dog's response. Max had been lying calmly on the courtroom floor for hours, trained to remain quiet and unobtrusive. But the moment Emma made that signal, the golden retriever had responded with such perfect understanding, such instantaneous recognition of the child's distress, that it was impossible to interpret as anything other than genuine emotional connection. The judge opened his eyes and reached for his phone. He dialed a number from memory: Doctor, the court psychologist who had previously worked on several of his cases. It was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening, but Judge Harrison knew that often worked late, and he also knew that she would want to discuss this case given its extraordinary nature. "It's Judge Harrison," he said when she answered. "I know it's late, but I need to consult with you about something that happened in court today, something I've never encountered before in my entire judicial career." Over the next 30 minutes, Judge Harrison recounted every detail of the courtroom drama: Richard's coaching of Emma, the recordings that had exposed his manipulation, Emma's testimony, and most crucially, her signal to Max and the dog's instantaneous response. "What I witnessed today was a profound breach of child-parent trust," Judge Harrison explained. "But what I also witnessed was something that transcended normal courtroom testimony. When that child made that signal to her dog, it was as if she was communicating something that her voice couldn't express, something her fear and trauma had prevented her from fully articulating. And the dog understood perfectly." Doctor was silent for a long moment. "Your Honor, what you're describing is actually well documented in psychological literature. There's a growing body of research suggesting that emotionally traumatized children often communicate more authentically with animals than with people, particularly when they've been manipulated by someone they love and trust. The neurobiological bond between a child and an emotional support animal can actually bypass the psychological defenses that abuse survivors erect." "So what you're telling me," Judge Harrison said slowly, "is that Max didn't just provide emotional comfort to Emma. He provided a means of authentic emotional expression that she couldn't access through any other channel." "Exactly," Doctor confirmed. "In trauma psychology, we call it nonverbal authentication. The child's body language, her gesture, her response to the dog's presence, these are actually more reliable indicators of truth than verbal testimony because they bypass the conscious mind's ability to lie or perform. The trauma response is encoded in the nervous system. The body cannot lie the way the conscious mind can." Judge Harrison felt the weight of this understanding settle over him. He had spent his entire career evaluating testimony, questioning witnesses, determining credibility. He prided himself on his ability to read people, but he had been relying primarily on verbal communication, on the content of what people said rather than on the nonverbal communication that often revealed more truth than words ever could. "I'm going to need you to submit a formal psychological evaluation," Judge Harrison said. "Not just of Emma, but of the entire dynamic between Emma, her father, and her emotional support animal. This case may set a precedent for how we evaluate testimony from traumatized children in custody proceedings." After hanging up with Doctor, Judge Harrison spent another 2 hours reviewing case law, precedents, and psychological research on emotional support animals and trauma. He found studies suggesting that children bonded with support animals exhibited lower cortisol levels, the stress hormone, and higher oxytocin levels, the bonding hormone. He found research indicating that nonverbal communication from traumatized children was often more reliable than their verbal testimony because it bypassed the psychological defenses erected by abuse. By the time Judge Harrison finished his research, he had reached several important conclusions. First, Emma's signal to Max was not merely an emotional moment in the courtroom. It was a critical piece of evidence about her true emotional state and her relationship with her father. Second, the dog's response provided objective, observable proof of genuine emotional connection that contrasted starkly with Richard's claimed bond with his daughter. Third, this case had the potential to influence how courts evaluated testimony from traumatized children going forward. But there was something deeper that moved Judge Harrison on a personal level, beyond the legal and psychological analysis. He thought about his own daughter, now grown, and how she had been his moral compass throughout his years on the bench. He thought about what it would have been like if she had been in Emma's position, caught between loyalty to a parent and her own survival, forced to choose between truth and the love of someone who was manipulating her. The judge made a decision. Tomorrow morning, he would issue a formal order for comprehensive psychological evaluation of both Emma and Richard. He would also order that Max be recognized as an official support animal in the courtroom proceedings, a formal acknowledgement that the dog's presence was not merely comforting but legally and psychologically significant. Most radically, he would write a detailed judicial opinion explaining how Emma's nonverbal communication, combined with Max's response, had been instrumental in his determination of the case's outcome. This opinion would become notable in legal circles. Law schools would study it. Other judges would reference it in their own cases involving traumatized children. But Judge Harrison didn't write it for those reasons. He wrote it because he had witnessed something extraordinary, and he believed that judges had a responsibility to recognize and document such moments when they occurred. The next morning, as Judge Harrison prepared to reconvene court, he thought once more about the signal, that simple gesture of 3 folded fingers and an extended thumb. Such a small, seemingly insignificant movement. Yet in that moment, it had communicated volumes about abuse, trauma, love, and truth. It had revealed more than hours of testimony or mountains of documentation. It had shown Judge Harrison something he thought he'd learned long ago but had somehow forgotten. Sometimes the most important truths cannot be spoken. Sometimes they can only be felt, recognized, and honored by those with wisdom enough to perceive them. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with renewed determination. Emma sat quietly beside her mother, Max's head resting on her lap. When the judge looked at that image of a traumatized child finding solace in an animal's unconditional presence, he knew with absolute certainty that he was making the right decision. Justice, he realized, was not merely about applying law to facts. It was about recognizing and protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their love and trust. And sometimes, an extraordinary judge had to look beyond legal precedent and into the hearts of the people before him to find the truth that mattered most. That morning, Judge Harrison's decision would change the trajectory of not just this case, but potentially of how courts across the country approached testimony from traumatized children. And it had all begun with a little girl's desperate signal to her dog. Doctor's office was designed to be calming and safe. Soft neutral colors, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books about child psychology, trauma recovery, and emotional development. Yet despite the soothing environment, Emma trembled as she sat in a child-sized chair across from the psychologist, with Max lying protectively at her feet. This would be the formal psychological evaluation that Judge Harrison had ordered, a comprehensive assessment designed to document the extent of Emma's psychological trauma and her father's emotional manipulation. Doctor was a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes, gray-streaked hair, and an air of gentle competence that immediately put children at ease. She had been conducting psychological evaluations for 32 years, and had developed an extraordinary ability to create safety for traumatized children. She understood that Emma would need space, time, and absolute reassurance that nothing she said would be used against her or make things worse. "Emma, I'm so glad you and Max could come see me today," Doctor began, her voice warm and unhurried. "I'm not a judge, and I'm not here to make decisions about where you live or who you see. My job is simply to understand what you've been through and to help make sure that people who care about you understand how to help you feel safe and happy. Does that sound okay?" Emma nodded slowly, her small hand reaching down to touch Max's soft fur. The dog's presence was the only reason she had agreed to come at all. "Emma, I want to start by asking you about something very important. Can you tell me about a time when your daddy asked you to practice what you were going to say to the judge?" Doctor asked gently. Emma's entire body stiffened. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Doctor immediately noticed the physiological stress response, the classic signs of re-traumatization as Emma approached the memory. "It's okay," Doctor said softly. "Max is right here with you. There's no rush. You can tell me in your own time or we can take breaks whenever you need to." Over the next 2 hours, Emma slowly, painfully began to recount her experiences. She described how her father had forced her to sit at his glass dining table for hours while he drilled her on lies. She talked about the notebook filled with his handwriting, the script of words she was supposed to memorize and repeat to the judge. She described how he would become angry when she hesitated, how his voice would turn cold and disappointed when she didn't sound convincing enough. "He said if I didn't do it right, I'd be a bad daughter," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said he'd be sad forever. He said it would be my fault." Doctor's hands clenched as she took detailed notes. What Emma was describing was not simple parental coaching. It was systematic emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, and grooming for perjury. "Emma, did your daddy ever tell you what would happen if you didn't listen to him?" Doctor asked carefully. He said nobody would like me anymore," Emma said, her voice breaking. "He said if I was a bad daughter, nobody would want to be my friend. He said Mommy would be happy if I was bad." The psychologist recognized this as a classic manipulation tactic, isolating the child, making her feel responsible for an adult's emotional, creating fear about social rejection and maternal abandonment. It was textbook emotional abuse. "Emma, I need to ask you something very important, and I want you to know that you won't get in trouble no matter what you say," Doctor said. "Did your daddy ever hurt you or touch you in ways that made you feel uncomfortable?" Emma shook her head vigorously. "No, he made me feel scared. He made me feel like everything was my fault." Doctor made a note. While there was no indication of physical or sexual abuse, the emotional abuse was severe and systematic. She spent the next hour administering psychological tests, age-appropriate assessments that measured Emma's anxiety levels, her capacity for trust, her self-esteem, and her overall emotional functioning. The results were starkly concerning. Emma's anxiety levels were significantly elevated in the clinical range associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. Her self-esteem was critically low, with Emma blaming herself for her father's emotional distress. She exhibited hypervigilance, constantly scanning her environment for threats and approval. Her cortisol levels, when measured, were chronically elevated, indicating sustained stress exposure. "Emma, I want to show you something," Doctor said, pulling up a simple diagram on her computer. "See these 2 pictures. One shows a person who feels safe and loved. Their body is relaxed, their face is happy. The other shows a person who feels scared or hurt. Their body is tight, their face is worried. Can you point to which one looks like how you felt when you were with your daddy?" Without hesitation, Emma pointed to the anxious figure. "And which one looks like how you feel when you're with Max?" Doctor asked. Emma pointed to the relaxed, happy figure without any hesitation whatsoever. She looked down at Max and gently stroked his head. The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor. "That's very important information," Doctor said. "Your body knows the difference between people and things that make you feel safe and people and things that make you feel scared. Your body is very smart about that." As the session continued, Emma began to describe incidents in more detail. She talked about the time her father had made her practice the lies while standing in front of a mirror for 2 hours. She described his exact words when she made mistakes. "You're not trying hard enough. You're being selfish. Don't you love your daddy?" She recounted the moment she'd realized her father didn't actually care about spending time with her. He only cared about winning against her mother. He kept asking me questions about Mommy, about things she said, about her friends, but he never asked me about school or my art projects or my friends. He just wanted me to tell him bad things about Mommy. Doctor's expression grew increasingly grim as she documented this. What Richard had done was not just emotionally abusive. It was a calculated attempt to manipulate his daughter into serving as a weapon in his custody war. He had instrumentalized her, treating her not as a beloved child, but as a tool to be used and controlled. Toward the end of the session, Doctor introduced a crucial element of assessment. She had Emma engage with Max in a structured observation exercise. She asked the dog to perform the signal with Emma, the three fingers folded, thumb-extended gesture that had become so significant in the courtroom. Emma made the signal, and Max immediately responded, placing his head on her lap and making eye contact with profound understanding. Doctor watched carefully, observing not just Max's response but Emma's entire physiological transformation. Within seconds of Max responding to her signal, Emma's breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed, her facial expression softened. Her cortisol levels would have dropped measurably in that moment. "That's remarkable," Doctor murmured, making detailed notes. "Emma, what you just showed me is something very important. When you make that signal to Max, your body immediately feels safer. Your brain knows that Max understands you and loves you without any conditions. That's a very powerful form of communication." Near the end of the session, Doctor asked Emma one final question. "Emma, if you could tell the judge or your daddy or anyone who needed to know about what happened, what would you want them to understand?" Emma was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I want them to know that my daddy made me feel like I was bad, like everything was my fault. And I want them to know that I love my daddy, but he scared me. I don't want to be scared anymore." That evening, Doctor sat at her own desk and began typing her comprehensive psychological evaluation. The report would be devastating in its clinical precision. She documented systematic emotional abuse and psychological manipulation, grooming of a minor child for perjury, coercive coaching using guilt, shame, and threats of abandonment, emotional blackmail through conditional love, isolation tactics designed to make the child feel responsible for parental emotional, significant anxiety disorder, hypervigilance, and post-traumatic stress symptoms in the child. Clear evidence that the child's authentic emotional state, as demonstrated through non-verbal communication and physiological response to the support animal, contradicted the coached testimony the father had attempted to produce. Clinical assessment that continued contact with the father without substantial intervention would result in ongoing psychological harm. But the most powerful section of Doctor's report was her observation about Max. The child's emotional support animal demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the child's emotional state and authentic needs. The nonverbal signal developed between child and animal serves as a form of authentic communication that bypasses the child's psychological defenses and coached responses. When the child engages with the animal, measurable physiological stress indicators decrease, and genuine emotional authenticity emerges. This suggests that the child's true emotional state and needs are far more accurately reflected in her nonverbal communication with the animal than in any coached or verbally articulated testimony. Doctor attached photographs of Emma making the signal to Max, images capturing the moment of authentic emotional connection. She included the psychological test results, the cortisol measurements, the anxiety assessments. Her report was thorough, scientific, and absolutely damning to Richard Mitchell's case. As she prepared to send the report to Judge Harrison, Doctor reflected on what Emma had told her. I don't want to be scared anymore. That simple statement, more than any clinical finding, represented the true purpose of her work. Emma deserved to grow up without fear, without the burden of her father's emotional manipulation, without the constant weight of responsibility for an adult's. And if doctors' report could help ensure that outcome, then every hour spent in this case would be worth it. The psychological bombshell was ready to detonate, armed with the power of truth, science, and the unwavering commitment to protect a vulnerable child from further harm. 3 days after doctors' psychological evaluation had been submitted, Judge Harrison reconvened the court for final arguments and his judicial determination. The courtroom was more crowded than ever before. Word had spread through legal circles, through the local media, and through social media about this extraordinary case involving a child's signal to her dog that had exposed psychological abuse. Court observers, legal scholars, and journalists filled every available seat. The intensity in the room was palpable. Everyone sensed that today would bring a conclusive determination that would have far-reaching implications. Richard sat at the defendant's table with his public defender, David. Richard looked diminished somehow, as if the weight of his own behavior had physically compressed him. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes were red-rimmed from days of sleepless nights. He had not seen Emma in the days since his public defender had advised him to cease contact pending the outcome of the case. The absence of his daughter, whom he claimed to love so desperately, had apparently devastated him. Whether this was genuine remorse or simply fear of consequences remained to be seen. Sarah sat at the opposite table with Jennifer, holding Emma's hand. Behind them, Max lay calmly on a specially designated cushion, his presence a constant reminder to everyone in the courtroom of the extraordinary connection that had become central to this case. Emma was dressed in a simple navy dress, her hair braided neatly. She looked smaller than she had during her testimony, as if the emotional ordeal had physically diminished her. But there was something different in her eyes now, a clarity, a sense of no longer carrying the weight of impossible secrets. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with Doctor's comprehensive psychological report in his hands. His expression was grave, his jaw clenched with controlled emotion. He had reviewed the report multiple times, cross-referencing the psychological findings with the evidence already presented. The clinical documentation was devastating. It corroborated everything Emma had to and provided scientific grounding for what had previously seemed like a child's words against her father's protestations of innocence. "This court is back in session," Judge Harrison announced, banging his gavel. "I have reviewed the comprehensive psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. licensed clinical psychologist with 32 years of experience in trauma assessment and family dynamics. I have reviewed the audio and video evidence. I have reviewed the text messages and documented communications. I have reviewed the testimony given under oath. And I have observed the interaction between the minor child and her emotional support animal." The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on Judge Harrison. "This court finds," Judge Harrison continued, his voice heavy with the weight of his words, "that Richard Mitchell has engaged in systematic emotional abuse of his minor child. He has manipulated her through guilt, shame, and threats of abandonment. He has coached her to commit perjury. He has used her as a tool in his custody war against Sarah Mitchell. These are not trivial allegations. These are serious matters involving the psychological abuse of a child." Richard's public defender stood to interject, but the judge raised his hand, silencing any interruption. "Mister, I suggest you advise your client to remain silent and listen," Judge Harrison said coldly. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming," the judge continued. "Doctors' evaluation documents acute anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and severe psychological trauma consistent with prolonged emotional abuse. The child exhibits classic markers of manipulation, hypervigilance, self-blame, conditional self-worth, and fear of parental abandonment. Most significantly, when the child attempted authentic emotional expression through nonverbal communication with her support animal. That expression was met with genuine understanding and response, contrasting starkly with the conditional love demonstrated by her father, which was contingent upon her compliance with his lies. Judge Harrison paused, allowing the weight of these findings to settle over the courtroom. Furthermore, he said, I am compelled to note that in my 40 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such clear evidence of a child's true emotional state expressed through nonverbal communication. The signal made by Emma Mitchell to her dog Max was not coached. It was not performed. It was authentic. And the dog's response, immediate, intuitive, and perfect in its understanding, provided observable evidence of genuine emotional connection that illuminated the falsity of Mr. Mitchell's claims of a loving, close relationship with his daughter. Richard suddenly stood up, his face flushed with rage and desperation. This is injustice. This is lies. That child is being coached by her mother. I love Emma. Everything I did was for her. Sit down, Mr. Mitchell, Judge Harrison commanded, his voice like thunder. You will have an opportunity to speak, but interrupting this court is contempt. Court officers, if Mr. Mitchell cannot maintain composure, remove him from the courtroom. Richard's public defender quickly pulled him back into his seat, whispering urgently in his ear. Richard was visibly shaking, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Judge Harrison continued as if there had been no interruption. This court awards primary physical and legal custody of Emma Mitchell to her mother, Sarah Mitchell. Effective immediately, all unsupervised visitation by Richard Mitchell is terminated. Mr. Mitchell may have supervised visitation with Emma, 4 hours per month in a supervised setting, with a court-appointed monitor present, pending completion of court-ordered psychological counseling and parenting education, focused on healthy emotional boundaries and non-coercive communication. The courtroom erupted. Journalists gasped and immediately began typing frantically on their laptops. Sarah burst into tears, embracing Emma tightly. Emma, for her part, showed little visible reaction. She simply pressed her face against her mother's shoulder, finally able to relax the constant vigilance that had characterized her life for so long. Furthermore, Judge Harrison said, raising his voice above the commotion, I am referring Mr. Richard Mitchell to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into charges of child abuse, emotional manipulation, and perjury. Mr. Mitchell, you are hereby advised that you have the right to legal representation and that anything you say may be used against you in criminal proceedings. Richard's face went completely white. His public defender began frantically speaking with him, explaining his rights and the seriousness of criminal charges. Additionally, Judge Harrison continued, I am ordering that emotional support animals be formally recognized as providing legally and psychologically significant support in cases involving traumatized children. The nonverbal communication demonstrated by the minor child with her support animal and the animal's response shall be admissible as evidence of authentic emotional expression in future custody proceedings. I am writing a detailed judicial opinion on this matter that will be published and available for reference in other cases throughout the district and potentially beyond. The judge's gavel came down hard, the sound like a punctuation mark ending a particularly significant chapter of justice. This hearing is concluded. Mr. Mitchell, you are released to the custody of the District Attorney's Office pending arrangement of bail on the criminal charges. Sarah Mitchell, Emma Mitchell remains in your custody. Court officers will provide information regarding supervised visitation arrangements. As the court officers moved toward Richard to process his release and arrest on the criminal charges, he looked at Emma one final time. The child met his gaze but showed no emotion. Just a blank, neutral expression that spoke volumes about the disconnect between the father who had demanded her loyalty and the frightened little girl who had finally been liberated from his manipulation. Richard was led out of the courtroom in a state of shock. His expensive attorney had abandoned him, recognizing that criminal charges meant he was now a liability rather than a lucrative client. His public defender followed, already discussing representation for the criminal proceedings ahead. Sarah stood up with Emma in her arms, and Max immediately stood as well, pressing against both of them. The image was striking, a mother and child finally safe, protected by the unwavering loyalty of an animal that had understood their truth before anyone else could see it. Jennifer embraced both Sarah and Emma, tears streaming down her face. "You were so brave, Emma, so incredibly brave. You did exactly the right thing." As Sarah, Emma, and Max moved toward the courtroom doors, the journalists surged forward with questions and cameras flashing. But Judge Harrison's court officers created a protective barrier, allowing them to pass without harassment. Outside the courthouse, standing on the marble steps in the afternoon sunlight, Sarah knelt down and looked into Emma's eyes. "It's over now, baby. It's finally over. You're safe. You're protected. And nobody will ever force you to lie again." Emma simply nodded and hugged her mother, with Max pressed between them, three beings bound together by love, loyalty, and the extraordinary power of truth finally told. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harrison sat alone at his bench, reading Doctor's psychological report one more time. He underlined a particular passage. The child's authentic emotional state, as expressed through nonverbal communication with her support animal, demonstrates more truth about her and relationships than any coached or verbally articulated testimony could possibly convey. The judge made a note to himself. This case will change how we understand justice for children. This case will remind us that sometimes the most important truths are communicated through love itself. 6 months had passed since Judge Harrison's gavel came down and changed Emma Mitchell's life forever. The transformation in the 7-year-old girl was nothing short of miraculous. Sarah watched her daughter with a sense of profound gratitude and wonder as Emma sat at the kitchen table, humming cheerfully while coloring a picture of a golden retriever that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Max. The dark circles under Emma's eyes, which had been so pronounced during the custody hearing, had faded completely. Her face had filled out, no longer gaunt and pinched with anxiety. Most importantly, her eyes sparkled with the light of childhood joy that had been so absent for so long. "Mommy, look, I'm making a picture of Max to hang on his wall," Emma announced, holding up her artwork with genuine enthusiasm. The drawing was crude and childlike in the way that all children's art is, but it was filled with love and creativity. Max, lying on his dog bed in the corner of the kitchen, lifted his head and thumped his tail at the mention of his name, as if he understood that he was the subject of Emma's artistic attention. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah said, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "Max is going to love it." The nightmare that had characterized Emma's life before the trial seemed like a distant memory now. She was sleeping through the night without interruption, no longer plagued by the anxiety-induced insomnia that had kept her awake for so many nights during the months of her father's manipulation. She was no longer apologizing for everything, no longer carrying the unbearable weight of responsibility for adult emotions. She was, simply and beautifully, a child again. Emma's grades at school had improved dramatically. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs., had noticed an almost instantaneous change in Emma's academic performance and classroom behavior once the custody case was resolved. Emma was raising her hand to participate in class discussions. Her standardized test scores had jumped significantly, and she was engaging with her classmates in a way that suggested genuine social confidence rather than the anxious people-pleasing behavior that had previously characterized her interactions with peers. "Emma has blossomed," Mrs. had told Sarah during parent-teacher conferences. "I don't know what you changed, but whatever it is, it's working beautifully. She's happy, engaged, and thriving." Sarah had simply smiled and thanked the teacher, knowing that the change had nothing to do with her parenting adjustments, and everything to do with the removal of the psychological abuse that had been suffocating her daughter. But perhaps most significant were Emma's interactions with Max. The dog remained her constant companion, and the bond between them had only deepened in the months following the trial. Emma had come to understand, in her own childlike way, that Max had saved her. He had understood her when no one else could. He had answered her desperate signal when she had no other way to communicate the truth. That recognition had created a connection between child and animal that transcended typical pet owner relationships. Doctor had continued to see Emma monthly for follow-up psychological counseling to help process the trauma and support her ongoing healing. During these sessions, Emma's progress had been remarkable. Her anxiety levels, once elevated to clinical significance, had dropped into the normal range. Her self-esteem had rebuilt substantially. She was developing healthy coping mechanisms and beginning to understand, in age-appropriate ways, that the manipulation she'd experienced was not her fault and did not reflect any deficiency in her as a person. Emma has shown exceptional resilience, Doctor had told Sarah during one of their consultation sessions. Children are remarkably capable of healing when they're provided with safety, stability, and unconditional love. Emma has all three of those things with you and Max. Richard, meanwhile, was facing very different circumstances. His criminal trial on charges of child abuse and perjury was scheduled for the following month. He had pleaded not guilty, maintaining his claim of innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. His public defender had advised him that his best strategy was to pursue a plea deal, potentially pleading guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for reduced sentencing. Richard had rejected this advice, insisting that his manipulation of Emma had been justified, that he was merely being a dedicated father trying to maintain his relationship with his daughter. The investigation had uncovered additional damaging evidence. His ex-girlfriend had come forward with information about similar patterns of manipulation she'd witnessed when Richard had been coaching Emma during visits. Teachers had documented concerning statements Emma had made about her father's coaching. The social media posts Richard had made discussing his custody battle revealed a disturbing narcissistic worldview in which he positioned himself as a victim being persecuted by an alienating mother, despite all evidence to the contrary. Richard had been ordered to complete a psychological evaluation as well, and the results had been troubling. The court psychologist had found evidence of narcissistic personality disorder traits, including lack of empathy, need for control, and willingness to exploit others, including his own daughter, to achieve his objectives. The evaluation concluded that without significant intervention and genuine commitment to change, Richard posed an ongoing risk to Emma's psychological. His supervised visitation had begun as ordered by the court. The first session had been heartbreaking to observe. Richard had attempted to win Emma back with expensive gifts and promises of trips to Disneyland, the same manipulation tactics that had characterized his behavior before the trial. Emma, however, had approached him with polite but emotional distance. She was cordial but guarded, responding to his attempts at connection with the wariness of a child who had learned that love from this man came with strings attached. "Daddy, I don't want to go to Disneyland," Emma had told him during that first supervised visit, her voice calm and clear. "I just want you to be nice to me and not make me do things that aren't true." The Monitor had reported that Richard had seemed stunned by this statement, as if it had never occurred to him that his daughter might simply want straightforward parental affection rather than grand gestures designed to manipulate. The supervised visits had continued once per month, and Emma had maintained her emotional boundaries with remarkable maturity for a 7-year-old. She was cordial but not emotionally intimate. She engaged with her father in conversation but did not share her inner world with him. She was protecting herself, as children who have been abused often learn to do. Judge Harrison's published judicial opinion had become something of a watershed moment in family law. Legal scholars had cited it in academic journals. Other judges had referenced it in their own custody decisions involving traumatized children. The concept of recognizing nonverbal communication and emotional support animals as valid evidence had begun to gain traction throughout the legal system. Most remarkably, Emma's story had reached beyond legal circles. News outlets had picked up the story Child Signal to Dog Exposes Father's Abuse in Custody Case. The image of Emma and Max on the courthouse steps had circulated widely on social media, touching hearts across the country. Strangers sent letters to Sarah expressing their own experiences with custody manipulation, their gratitude for Emma's bravery, their hope that her case would change the system to better protect children. One particular letter had come from a woman in another state who had been struggling with her own custody case. After reading about Emma and Max, she had gathered the courage to speak truthfully about her ex-partner's manipulation of her own child, ultimately resulting in a custody determination that prioritized her child's safety and rather than the abuser's claims. "Emma, your bravery is changing the world," the woman had written. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth." Sarah had read that letter to Emma, age, appropriately explaining that by being honest about what had happened to her, Emma had helped other children in similar situations. Emma had listened solemnly, then asked, "Did their dogs help them too?" Sarah had smiled through her tears and said, "Maybe not with a dog, but they had people and things that helped them be brave, just like Max helped you." 9 months after the trial, on a warm Saturday afternoon in early spring, Sarah took Emma and Max to the local park. Emma ran through the grass with the freedom and joy that only a child who had truly been liberated could express. Max ran beside her, his golden fur gleaming in the sunlight, his tail wagging with pure joy. Sarah sat on a park bench and watched her daughter, marveling at the transformation. A woman approached Sarah hesitantly. "Excuse me, is this Emma, the girl from the courthouse case, with the dog?" Sarah nodded, wondering how to respond to this stranger. "I just wanted to say," the woman continued, her own eyes filled with tears, "that your daughter's story gave me the courage to leave my abusive husband and fight for custody of my own children. Thank you. Thank you for raising such a brave daughter." Sarah embraced the woman, both of them crying tears of recognition and solidarity, the understanding that abuse thrives in silence and shame, but truth and courage can liberate not just one child but potentially countless others. As the sun began to set over the park, Sarah watched Emma and Max play, child and dog, united by a bond forged in the crucible of trauma but transformed into something beautiful and healing. Emma's life would always carry the marks of what she had experienced. Recovery was not about forgetting, but about integrating those experiences into a life of meaning and resilience. But tonight, watching her daughter laugh and play freely, Sarah knew that her baby had been given the greatest gift of all, the freedom to be a child, to grow without fear, to love without manipulation, and to trust that the world could be safe. And it had all begun with a little girl's desperate signal to her dog, a moment when authentic love spoke louder than any lie, when genuine connection proved more powerful than calculated deception, and when justice, at last, sided with the vulnerable and the truth.